and how Radhika has been moving around all over the place. She was born in India. She lived in South Africa, and she eventually ended up going to the US and recently to Singapore. But let me give you a more concrete bio on Radhika, because I think it's well deserved. If you don't know Radhika so well, you might want to know that she's a co-founder of the um, radical product thinking movement. But more than that, she's an entrepreneur. She's a product leader. She has participated in 4 acquisitions as a result of the products she's built. And 2 of these were actually companies she founded. Radhika advises organizations from high-tech startups to government agencies and speaks at conferences around the world, including Productized into 2020 and now in 2021. And she has founded Radical Product Thinking as a movement of leaders creating vision-driven change. And she's also the author of an upcoming book titled The Radical Product Thinking, or better yet, Radical Product Thinking, the new mindset for innovating smarter, which is scheduled for launch in September 2021. And I hope you're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And by the way, she's also speaking 9 languages while learning her tense. I don't know if her tense is Portuguese, but if it is, you can count on us to help you out on that. So welcome, Radhika. And the last time you spoke, we actually spoke with each other. You were living in Singapore. So let's maybe start by that. How was that experience?
It was an amazing 2.5 years that we spent in Singapore. And I think, a lot of the things that I talk about in terms of being vision driven and what product thinking is about, so being that vision driven product person, it was amazing to see that in action in Singapore over the last 2.5 years, applied at, a country level. And just, when we were there, it was during the COVID pandemic. And what's amazing, right, is while other countries were in lockdown, Singapore was able to have a mostly normal life. But because of kind of this vision-driven approach that they took to even tackling COVID and how they managed to get it under control. So just to give you a small example, in Singapore, when they did do a lockdown very early, they called it a circuit breaker because it was their way of communicating the vision, like they were trying to, break the circuit. So they called it a circuit breaker, and masks became mandatory really early on and so on. So it was an amazing experience to have been there during part of the pandemic. And now we're in the US as of January 2nd.
All right. Do they have like a chief product officer in government or something like that?
It's fascinating. It's not, but they take this vision-driven approach in every agency. Like every agency has its vision posted. And if you go to the work permit office, that was my most interesting example. We had just arrived in Singapore and we had to go get our work permits. My kids were jet lagged. This was like, we were up since 2 a.m. And the work permit office talks about design thinking. They tell you, we want to give you control and certainty of the process. We treat our customers by name, not a number. And I'm like, customers? There's a government agency, and I'm looking around like, who are you calling a customer? It was brilliant, right? Like that you're in an immigration office and it's calling you a customer, and the experience didn't disappoint. So that's what I meant by this design thinking and vision-driven approach that's kind of pervasive in so many aspects of the government.
That's such a visionary, and it's at time inspiring. That's definitely, the future of successful governments going, right? So maybe just starting from the beginning and not your last tenure in Singapore, but a little bit about your background, interests, hobbies, aspect that you feel are important and have influenced you. You were talking about growing up in a foreign country and how that basically shaped your way.
Yeah, I think early on, so one of the things, my background is I've lived or worked in 4 different continents. So I lived in India, South Africa, in Asia, but also in the US, and I've worked in Europe for a little bit. But, I think this kind of a background gave me the ability to not just focus kind of in depth in just one area and be an expert in just one thing, but rather look at patterns more broadly.
Hmm.
And I guess the way it translates into my career is, instead of just being a specialist in kind of one industry, pretty much every job that I've ever had has always been in a different industry. And that seeing this pattern of both problems and solutions is really something that I've been able to bring into both radical product thinking, but also more broadly into the book as well.
So how did you decide to get into product? Because you had like a number of entrepreneurial experiences, but what was the moment you realized you really want to go this path of product? Most people, it tends to become almost like an experience they remember really well when they realize, oh, there's a job called product manager. Really? Can I do that? Can I be? So what was your story?
So my realization was that product is a mindset. And the way this came about was, I was working in a company called Avid. At the time, Avid was already well known in post production. So, meaning in Hollywood, pretty much every movie that has won an Oscar uses Avid for video editing. And at the time, this was in 2003, we were breaking into news production and using video editors and breaking into the broadcast industry. And so my title in that new role
Yeah.
was project manager for custom engineering. This is
Okay.
kind of like the diametric opposite of what a product manager is about, right? And what was fascinating is that's what got me into product, because I realized that product is really a life skill and a way of thinking. Because
Hmm.
my goal was I would work with customers to figure out like what was it that they needed, because all we
Hmm.
had was one product and we wanted to expand beyond that product and fulfill all of their needs. So we
Hmm.
had to talk to our news producers, news programmers, basically, and then figure out what was it that they needed, and then expand our product slowly. So we called it custom engineering, but the goal was really to figure out what was strategic and what other people needed as well, and then expand our product. And customers knew that they were participating or partnering with us and paying for custom engineering, but like we were doing things that were really expanding the product. Like it was this partnership. And so what I realized was, product is a way of thinking because it's like sales, it's
Hmm.
not that. So when you, for instance, are doing a job interview, you're essentially doing sales. But similarly, when you're doing product, like no matter what change you're trying to create in the world, you're really building products. So that was my realization that product is how you create change. It's a way of thinking so that you figure out like what is your mechanism, like how will you bring about that change,
Hmm.
and then you do it systematically. So that was kind of my beginning of the product journey, from something very counterintuitive and being called custom engineering.
All right, and you also have like an entrepreneurial journey there. Was that after? What happened? How did you get into becoming a founder?
The entrepreneurship journey actually started when I was doing my undergrad at MIT.
Hmm.
So myself and four other co-founders, we got together and we started our first company. It was called Lobby 7. And we had our first customer while I was still studying. We were still undergrads, and yeah, so we soon got funding after that, and we started our company. Um, and we learned.
What was that company about?
So we started out by trying to be the services company delivering wireless services at the time, right? This was back in 2000.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
Wireless services was kind of the hottest thing. I don't know, like many people may not remember, but that was the time where 3G licenses were being bought for billions
Yeah,
of dollars.
I remember those
That
days. Yeah.
Right. And so, everyone was saying this was the year of wireless, right?
Hmm.
Uh, and that was when we started Lobby 7. So we started as a wireless services company. We were going to build apps for companies. And what we realized was, and this was, by the way, my first foray into realizing the need for radical product thinking, we were being completely iteration led. Like our goal was, we were being a services company so that we could try out different markets and find product market fit by offering different services in different markets and seeing kind of what sticks. And that's where, that was an experience where we learned so much, because in the end, we managed to build a product. Like what we ended up building is what you would now call Siri. It was basically this way of being able to interact with your phone using voice as well as text. But we were too early to the market, like 7 years too early. This was in 2000, whereas the iPhone didn't come out till 2007.
Yeah.
So we were too early to the market, and we were just iteration led. And that was the realization that we need to build products differently, that we need to be more vision driven.
Right. And, you just told that you were at the MIT, or, what led you there? Were you always like, when you were in South Africa, you already knew that, hey, I want to be an engineer one day, or was this something that came where you went, to the US?
I think, yeah, when I was younger, I used to dream of being a scientist.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was this desire to go to MIT for a long time. And it's funny that it was after my first entrepreneurial experience that I realized that engineering was not what I wanted to do, that really it was something else. Like the entrepreneurship bug bit me.
Yeah, that happens a lot to lots of product engineers that come from product managers that come from the engineering background, right? They kind of understand, maybe I don't want to be a full stack engineer. I want to be something closer to marketing or sales or in between or translating, right? That was really cool. And you were telling that you wanted to go to the MIT, and I know Indian parents are kind of known for being a little bit pushy on their kids' destinies. Let's put it this way. So how was that dream shaping up? So your parents say, going to the US and you're going to study at MIT, and then you're going to become an engineer, or is this you realize, oh, I want to be an engineer. Let me just check what are the best engineering schools in the world. What was the story there? Because lots of people don't do that, right? Lots of kids I talk to, it just happenstance, just happens to be like that because that's what my friends are doing, and that's not really a roadmap that they define for themselves.
That is interesting. So I was really lucky. My parents are, very progressive. Their idea was, if you really like what you're doing, you can be the
Mhm.
best at anything. That was my dad's, quote always.
Okay.
You can do anything, just, you have to like what you do. So I
Wow.
was really lucky that way. That the idea of MIT came from my dad, actually, because, he's an engineer. And
Okay.
so he said, oh, you have to apply to MIT. And I was like, oh, what is that?
Okay.
And so that's how it started. But what you say about Asian parents, you're very right. Like my daughter went to a summer camp, and the teacher asked, so why did you guys do the summer camp? And the summer camp was about introduction to biomedical
Oh.
science. And her friend said, well, as my mom puts it, doctor, lawyer, or disappointment. So here I am.
Okay.
So, having heard that, like that's definitely something I want to make sure we never do.
Okay. Right. Okay. So just leapfrogging a little bit, you're also I guess you're a mom, and I think that's an important part of your life. How many kids do you have?
I have 2 kids.
All right. And I guess you're also a founder of this radical product movement. Or can you tell us a little bit about this project? What is the main purpose? The first time I heard about it was actually one of our speakers at Productized 2019, and and then I went check it out online, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. But you want to tell us a little bit about this project, how it came up, how what was the genesis?
Yeah, so the way it started was, as I mentioned, I'd worked in so many different industries and sizes of companies. But one thing that I kept seeing over and over was the same pattern of, problems where good products go bad.
Hmm.
And this is where, I was talking to two friends or ex-colleagues of mine, Nidhi Agarwal and Jodi Cadiz. And, it was interesting that they were seeing the same pattern of problems. And we started calling them product diseases.
Hmm.
And so the question we asked ourselves is, why is it that there are a few people who just seem to have this innate gift of being able to build products? These are
Hmm.
people like the Steve Jobs of the world. And
Hmm.
why is it that others don't just have this innate skill? Can people actually build this skill? And so that's where, radical product thinking started out. So we tried to take all the intuition and hard lessons that we'd learned
And
and things that
it started in the US, still in the US, before you went to Singapore, right?
exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. And it started with, us trying to translate all that intuition and the hard lessons through trial and error into a toolkit so that we could say,
Hmm.
can we build the skill systematically? To be vision driven, you start with a vision, but it's not clear like, okay, what is a good vision? How do you actually translate that into action? And so that's what we did to build this toolkit. And from there, we released the toolkit. And my first experience with this becoming a movement was I was speaking at a conference, and a person came out to talk to us afterwards, after the conference, and they came and said, "Wow, you guys created the toolkit. I had found this organically on Google, and she started using it, and it was so useful. She ended up talking about it at a conference."
Hmm.
And so we realized, like, wow, this is really becoming a movement. And so that was the start of us um, uh, creating, more material around it, blogs, etc. And now it's evolved into something where it's going to be a book in September.
All right. And the toolkit is also available for free if you want to go and check it out at the website. But can you tell us how can a product manager or even a product designer benefit from using it? What's the big outcome?
Yeah. So what I found happens often, right, is as product people, we are very used to using lean and agile. And we found that lean and agile are great. They help give us speed. Right. So we can innovate faster because we're lean and agile. But the problem is they don't tell us where we need to go. And lean and agile, basically, they're good for execution, but not for defining the direction. And so that's where radical product thinking comes in, where radical product thinking helps you define, what's the change you're really trying to create. And you define that in a lot of detail so you can align the team around that vision. Then it helps you translate it into a strategy, and then into a set of priorities, like, that helps give your entire team an intuition for making decisions like you would as a product leader.
Mhm.
And then finally, it helps you translate that into a set of hypotheses so you can use lean and agile for execution. So basically, the whole toolkit helps you very systematically craft a vision and use it every day so that everyday activities are aligned with that vision. And so that's why we created the toolkit, and we made it free because, anyone who wants to create vision driven change, we wanted to really help them be able to do that.
Right. And what about the product diseases? And this is something I find it really interesting. Um, so you catalog some of these product diseases and barriers into building products. What are the most common ones?
Yeah, so some of the most common ones, right, are one is pivotitis. So pivotitis is basically what happens to so many startups, and that was the
Mhm.
first experience that I was telling you about at Lobby 7
Right.
in our startup, right? So we, on purpose, almost said we're going to keep pivoting until we find product market fit,
Mhm.
and basically, when you keep pivoting, you end up losing momentum along the way. Your startup can only sustain so many pivots before you either run out of money or momentum. And so pivotitis basically
Okay,
happens
we
when you
should code you on that, right? That's so true. You have this pivot, but you have this number of pivots that you can take, right? So be
right.
cautious. So that's pivotitis, okay. And what do you have any other diseases?
Another example I often give is obsessive sales disorder, where, in the product world, this is basically where, your salesperson tells you, oh, all we have to do is add this one custom feature and we can win this big deal. And we say yes to that because it sounds mostly harmless, right? And then by the end of the year, your entire roadmap is driven by all these custom things our customers have asked for. Um, so pivotitis and obsessive sales disorder are the most common ones. Another one is strategic swelling, where your product just starts to grow and grow and grow until you don't recognize it anymore. It's trying to do everything for everyone, but doesn't do any one thing really well. So those are the common product diseases that really make good products go bad. But there are about 7 of them that I catalog in the book.
All right, and the book will be out soon. So let's talk about it in a couple of questions. Before that, I guess you have been working as a consultant with some of these companies. Regarding creating a clear vision, is there a risk of being sometimes too narrow on a vision or too tight on the kind of vision you're trying to to develop for a company, that you become so obsessed that you end up kind of forgetting what is there on the edges? And how do you balance this necessity of having a vision and also necessity of have the divergence to look on the side?
Yeah, and that's such an important question, right? Because you're exactly right. Everything that we've ever learned about what makes a good vision has always been about how a good vision has to be big, aspirational. It's often called a BHAG, or a big, hairy, audacious goal.
Right.
So we've always focused on big as opposed to the details.
Mm-hmm.
And as part of this radical approach, my goal has been to help companies get to the details, because the reality is, right? Um, I often talk about it like constructing a house. When you're constructing a house, the people constructing it, they need a blueprint. They don't
Mm-hmm.
need like the fancy picture of what you can't just do it based on like this grand vision of, I want to build the biggest house
Yeah,
possible.
right. You don't buy a decoration magazine and you right, you have a blueprint, right? Absolutely.
Exactly. And so my goal with this vision statement that I've created is to create this blueprint. And it has to be detailed enough, and you're not tied to the words, but the alignment, right? That's what I try to create. Like, very often, vision statements focus on memorizing a slogan. They want
Mm-hmm.
it to be short so that you'll remember it. My goal is not the memory, but rather internalizing the vision, because we share it and understand it so deeply. And so we created basically this Mad Libs or fill in the blank statement, where it answers really deep questions like, whose world are you trying to change? What does their world look like? Meaning, what's the problem? Why does it need solving? Because really, we should accept that maybe it doesn't even need solving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, what does the world look like when you've solved that problem? Like, how will you know that you've solved it? Um, and how will you bring that about? So once you answer these detailed questions, that's the alignment that you bring about in the team. Just those discussions bring about alignment. And then you have a vision that forms this blueprint, so that, when you're in the middle of a heated debate, that's what you can look at and you say, okay, are we being true to this vision?
All right. Um, so, regarding vision, an important aspect to it, and lots of companies out there, when vision is still is colliding with ethics, we have a problem, right? Or what vision ignores ethics at large, we have a problem, and we have seen lots of examples, and we all know the names. So the question is, how and why should ethics be applied into product management? And there has been lots of discussion about this in the last few years, but as a new generation of product managers comes to the market, Gen Z, millennials, I think this becomes an ever more present question, right? So do you have any framework for this, any kind of thought that you want to share with us?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I've realized is, as a product person, right, we're changing people's lives. Like whatever products we put out there, we are directly affecting people's lives. And
Mhm.
so incorporating ethics comes with that realization, first and foremost, that we affect people's lives. The moment we get that realization, right, then we can start to think about ourselves almost like doctors. Because if you think about a doctor's role is to look at a problem and then say, I'm going to solve that problem for the patient. And so, in solving that problem for the patient, the doctor has to think about the patient's well being. Like, you don't just say, I'm going to prescribe these drugs to you. And if your life is worse off because of those drugs, that's not my responsibility, right?
Mhm.
A doctor cannot say that. And so, as a product person, we have to take a similar approach. We're trying to solve this problem for the user, but we can't say that, well, if that makes your life worse off, too bad. That's
Right.
really the mindset that we need to shift. And so once we start to think about ourselves as doctors, then the next question is, okay, so how can we incorporate this mindset as we build products? And so that's where, in our vision, in our strategy, and how we translate that into our priorities, we really have to take these ethics into consideration. So, for example, when I talk about the vision, right, when I talk about the who, what, why, when, and how questions, you'll notice that one of the things that's not included in the vision is the question of, what are your business goals? The vision is not about you at all. It's really about what's the problem you're trying to solve and how will you solve it. Because let's think about a doctor. Imagine a doctor says that her vision is to treat the patient while building $1 million clinic. All of a sudden you listen to that vision and you're like, really, are you solving my problem, or are you trying to make money, right? So it's
Mhm.
the same thing with products, that in building our vision, we focus it really on who's the user. And then when we translate that into priorities, we think about it in a very similar way. And I want to clarify that in saying all of this, I'm not saying that profitability is not important. It is super important because, if we think about being um, vision driven, or about profits as well as purpose, companies, if we're not thinking about profits at all, if it's all about purpose, that's a charity. And charities have an important role in the world, but they cannot take the whole burden of making the world a better place. Businesses touch so many more lives than charities. And so ethics means that we have to think about profitability while also trying to be purpose driven. And that's how we can incorporate ethics in our everyday work.
All right. And look, we have a bunch of people listening to us. So what kind of advice would you give product managers on their journey to more senior role? That's one. And an opposite question, which is what kind of advice? So let's start maybe with what kind of advice would you give to young people that are listening to this conversation right now, that are either ending their masters or their degrees, and they want to go into product. And this is a very classical question, but we get it more and more. So what kind of ways would you recommend people start their product journey?
Excellent question. So I think in starting your product journey, um, as a good product person, you're constantly bringing the customer's perspective into how you're building a product, right? And so in building your product, always being able to see the big picture of what is the change I'm trying to bring for the customer. um, that's, if you can always keep that in the foreground. And the second piece was, how can you then start to use this to take on a more strategic role? So once you've created this big picture for yourself, whether through whatever product that you're working on, how am I
Hmm.
helping the customer? Then you want to really align your team on these ideas. So this is where, um, taking a more facilitative approach. So for example, both in terms of the vision statement, the strategy, or the prioritization approach I talk about in radical product thinking, it's really about communicating these ideas to the team. And so taking this approach where you're constantly building a shared rationale for why are we making the decisions that we are, that's really the key to taking on a more strategic role. So creating that alignment by facilitating discussions and making sure people are all agreed in terms of what's the shared picture we have of the world we're trying to create, a shared understanding of priorities, and an intuition, for making those right decisions. Like, it's the communication that's really important.
Mhm. Absolutely. And we were talking just before the podcast that, in your opinion, we were still lacking senior product manager, female senior product managers. Why do you think this is still a reality today?
Yeah, I think, even traditionally for a while, right, it's been the case that in leadership, there's a smaller representation of women. And that's going to take a long time to change. You were asking about advice for leaders. I think what we really need to do is be aware of the lack of such diversity in product as we rise in the ladders. So what I mean by that is, in as product managers, there is a pretty even distribution of men and women being product managers. But once you start looking at leadership teams, there are many more men being product leaders compared to women. Um, and so we have to be aware of what this means for the world when that happens, right? When we don't have representation in product leadership, it often leads to products that don't necessarily work for everyone, that they work
Hmm.
only for a percentage of the population.
Yeah.
Um, there are so many examples. The most recent one was the example of a Black researcher who's renowned, Timnit Gebru. She was talking about the Google algorithm and learning model, how by analyzing a large amount of speech data, it was actually incorporating a lot of the biases that is out there in text that's online, right? That's either
Hmm.
hate speech or biased speech. We need more people and diverse people to bring about these perspectives and to understand where our products, how they're affecting different people in the population.
Hmm.
And that can only come from those diverse perspectives. And so as leaders, we have to be aware of, whether we have the right representation so that we can make products that work for everyone.
Absolutely. And speaking about the next 5 years or so, what do you think are the skills that will be most important for a product leader? What do you see anything coming in that prospective 5 years? Do you think the same traits will remain the same? Um,
Yeah, one big change that I see coming, right, is and we're just starting to see this, and we're at the beginning stages. In the last decade, like basically Lean Startup was published in 2011, and in the last decade, what we've seen is, iteration has really become the mechanism for how we build products. Building products has always been about iteration. And what has fueled that approach, this over reliance on iteration, right, has been that we've had a lot of credit that's been accessible. There's been such an abundance of credit that it's been really easy to say, oh, you know what, we'll try this. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And I think we talked early on about how every startup, you only have a finite number of pivots before you run out of momentum and money. That window is going to shrink because in the post pandemic economy, wallets are going to be tighter. There isn't going to be as much of an abundance of credit as there once was. And so, as we prepare for doing well in this sort of an economy, in the post-pandemic economy, we really have to think about, how can we take a more vision-driven approach? Just iteration alone is not going to do the trick. And so the trend that I see in this next 5 years is we're going to need to learn how to iterate less and achieve more. And that was actually if I recall, I think that was the title of the Productized talk that I was giving, or that was one of the main messages,
Yeah.
that we can really iterate less and do more with those iterations. And to do that, we need to take a more vision-driven approach.
Okay, and I guess you are also going, or that's part of what the book will be speaking about. I don't know too many details about the book, but I would really appreciate if you could tell us a little bit about the upcoming book, Radical Product Thinking: The New Mindset for Innovating Smarter. Congratulations, by the way. I know it must be quite a new baby coming in. So can you tell us a little bit more about the book, and give maybe our listeners some recommendations on, how they could get their hands on the book as soon as possible?
Um, Thank you. So the book comes out in September, but it'll be available on pre-order on Amazon pretty soon. I think in the next month and a half or so, it should be out there.
Mhm.
Um, So the book is about, how do we build these vision-driven products? It talks about how you can use vision, strategy, prioritization, and it gives you a very systematic approach to be able to do this. And it explains how you can use this method to be able to avoid product diseases, as well as avoid what I call digital pollution. So, when we talked about ethics, one of the things we have to realize is just as the industrial growth over the many, let's say the last century has created environmental pollution, similarly, the digital economy has
Mhm.
created digital pollution. And
Right.
so I talk about how we can build vision-driven products that overcome both these product diseases
Mhm.
and digital pollution.
All right. So one of the diseases that I see a lot here in the IT companies in Portugal is, they have great engineering skills and they have lots of good people, but they never embrace a product culture that allows them to create product in the first place. And one of the diseases is because they have this kind of Stockholm syndrome where they get hijacked by one specific client or a couple of clients, and those clients end up being such a big part of the revenue of the company that they're basically hijacked by those clients, right? So if they decide to do a product, they end up saying, okay, but how can we do a product and then maybe lose focus on the specific client, asking for, obsessive sales disorder, feature X, Y, or Z, and then, that's one of the most common diseases that I've in my career I've seen so many times here. So if you can somehow shed some light on that in your book, I think it would be super useful, at least for the product community. But anyways, we have a bunch of questions for you that have been popping up and also during the registration phase. And our first question is actually from my sister that she's listening to this podcast. So hi, Marianne. So hi, Radhika and Andre. Thanks for the great event so far. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the future of Clubhouse monetization, for instance, and if synchronous products are here to stay or just a fad. So do you want to talk about Clubhouse and synchronous products like that?
Um, This one, it's really hard to say. I think, one of the things about monetization, right, that I've found, the trend has, until now, because of the abundance of credit, the trend has always been, oh, first get traction, then we'll figure out how to monetize it. I think that's the piece that's really going to change. That, I think that's going to be harder to sustain as credit becomes a little harder to come by. Do you have any thoughts, Andre, that you'd like to share on this one?
Actually, I'm still kind of digesting the whole Clubhouse thing. So I have no specific thoughts on that one. Sorry, Mariana, but you got the answer from Radhika. All right, so we have another question here from Jose Oliveira. Hi, Jose. And the question from Jose is, what are the best tips to manage communication between product managers and product owners? Okay, so Radhika, product managers and product owners communication.
Interesting. Okay, so one of the techniques that I've used is the approach to prioritization that I use. So what I use for prioritization is basically this 2x2. It's an X and a Y axis. Your Y axis is this a good vision fit or not? And the x-axis is this helping us survive or not? Survive meaning like, you have to decide kind of what's your biggest risk. Is it financial? Maybe it's a stakeholder. Maybe, you're trying to please bosses because your boss could kill this product tomorrow. So basically what you're trying to do together with your product owner, you're trying to manage doing good by your vision and doing the right thing by your vision, and you're trying to manage surviving at the same time. So it's balancing this long term and the short term, right? And so basically everything that's helping you both with the vision fit and if it is helping you survive, those are of course ideal. Those are the easy decisions. The harder decisions are investing in the vision. This is basically where it's not helping you survive in the short term, but it is a good vision fit. This is, for example, let's say you're doing 3 months of code refactoring and your product owner says, unless we do this, we just aren't going to be able to build anymore. And so, together you may decide that we have to invest in the vision. And the last example is, obsessive sales disorder, which goes in vision debt, which is basically it's helping you survive, but it's not a good vision fit. And so that's vision debt. It's like technical debt, except it's on the vision side. And so together with your product owner, you would talk about, okay, what are the things that are ideal vision debt or, investing in the vision. Of course, you would avoid things that are, both bad for the vision and it's not helping you survive, but that's an easy decision.
Right.
And so you would, in your priorities, in your sprint, decide, most of those things that you'll do are ideal. Occasionally, wherever you can, you do some things that are in the investing in the vision quadrant because you can afford to invest in the vision. And then sometimes you'll do vision debt because, you need to survive and feed the people. And maybe that's kind of what you have to take.
Yeah, the problem in a local IT company is it's all vision debt, right? So, and I guess and in this case, Jose Oliveira is from Portuguese IT and is the VP of product at Eneda.io, is a smart cities company. So what you're saying is that we should have a balance. And what kind of balance should we have? Is there any kind of balance, specific balance? Is it because I guess the second question is, okay, so how much should be vision and how much should be what's the vision depth limit, right, that you can have?
And great question, right? And the answer to that question is very specific for your company, and which is why I go back to this as a communication tool, and where you build that understanding, and you have to have that discussion. How much vision debt do we really have to take on? Maybe you have really no money in your company. You're really desperate. All you can afford to do is vision debt. And maybe that's what you have to do. But like maybe you do have some flexibility. Maybe you don't have to take on all of this vision debt. But I think one of the most important things is labeling something vision debt, right? Because once you start recognizing something as vision debt, now you can say, okay, here's my plan to be able to pay back vision debt. I'll go invest in the vision by doing this. And so that's basically the idea where you use this as a communication tool and we agree on how much we take on from each quadrant. That balance has to be right for your organization.
All right. So last question from Paulo. So Paulo is asking, can you talk about your experience in the exit strategies that you participate? And I guess one of those you talked about. although not the exit strategy itself. And did you optimize the product growth strategy for those exits? Was it something you guys were planning? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, great question. And, I will admit that, yes, we did have to think about product growth strategy as part of our exit strategy, right? So the way to think about it is as you're I've talked about being vision driven, etc. The reality is you do kind of have to think about your exit strategy, and you have to think about there's a lot of focus on growth hacking recently.
What happened in your specific cases, the exits you were involved, either for Lobby 7 or any other companies that you have been able to do an exit?
So let me talk about the exit for my last startup, which was Likely. It was a wine startup. Think of it like
Mhm.
Netflix for wine. We
Mhm.
were
Oh,
recommending.
that sounds pretty good. And useful for the pandemic as well.
True, true. We were too early to the market. We should have just waited until this.
Yeah, let's just wait for the pandemic to come in and we'll strike gold.
Right. Uh, so what we were doing was we were giving recommendations and delivering wine. In terms of our exit strategy, what we needed to be able to show was that the recommendations that we were giving was in fact leading to sales.
Mhm.
But really early on in your product, that's kind of the last step in the funnel. That's not necessarily where you end up optimizing in the early stages, right? And yet, if you think about that vision versus survival that I just talked about, unless we were able to show that our recommendations were leading to sales, it wouldn't have helped us in terms of our exit strategy. And so that was something that we said, you know what, we'll take on a little bit of vision debt. And we did do some amount of optimization, although most of our other efforts were spent on ideal or investing in the vision quadrants. So this is where yes, in terms of planning some amount of growth hacking, you do end up recognizing that you're doing this as vision debt when you're doing things just purely for growth, right?
Mhm.
But at the same time, like sometimes it's necessary. The important thing is to be able to agree on how much to take on. The thing I find is a lot of companies are so focused on exit strategies and growth hacking that you kind of lose sight of what's the main problem that you're setting out to solve. And that's the one thing you want to avoid.
All right. And that was it. So thank you so much. We had other questions, but we don't have time to cover all of the questions. So thank you so much, Radhika, for staying with us today. It was super insightful and interesting, as I was actually expecting, because such an interesting and deep person. Let's, if people want to reach out to you, if they want to have, if they want to actually do the questions that we were not able to do here today, how can they reach you?
And thank you, Andre. This was such a fun conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
If people would like to reach out, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. And you can also email me at radhika@radicalproduct.com.
All right. So guys, if you want to have Radhika before the book, one of the possibilities, of course, is to come to the Productized masterclasses, and you'll have 1.5 hour of a masterclass by Radhika on it's almost as good as having Radhika on stage, but unfortunately we can still not have that happening here in Portugal for the next 6 months or so. Looking forward to meet you in Portugal as soon as we can, or in the US, or God knows where. So Radhika, thank you so much for being with us, and see you soon.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the masterclasses.
Bye-bye.
Bye.